Imagine a wealthy landowner in the heart of old Madrid, a man named Juan de Vargas, a man of logic, a man of business. He had a growing suspicion that one of his laborers was cheating him. The other workers were whispering. They were complaining. They said that Isidore was arriving late every single morning because he would stop to hear mass before starting his day, while the other men were already sweating in the fields. Isidore was on his knees in the quiet of a church. Juan de Vargas decided he had seen enough. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. He crept out early, hiding behind the thick thickets at the edge of the plot, and he waited. Sure enough, Isidore arrived late, as he always did. But as Vargas looked out toward the field, preparing to confront him, what he saw rooted him to the spot in absolute terror and wonder. Two teams of snow-white oxen, animals that belonged to no one in that valley, were plowing the earth right alongside Isidore. They were guided by luminous figures, beings that were clearly not of this world. The angels were plowing, while Isidore prayed. And when the master finally ran out to confront him, the mysterious oxen vanished into thin air, but the earth remained, perfectly tilled. In fact, there was more land plowed than any single man with a single plow could have accomplished in an entire day. Juan de Vargas never complained again. Instead, he did something unheard of. He appointed Isidore as the administrator of his entire estate. That scene, an illiterate farmhand plowing alongside angels on the outskirts of Madrid, became the most iconic image of one of the most unique saints in the Christian calendar. He was the first married layman to be formally canonized by the church, a man of the soil who reached the heights of heaven. But the Madrid where Isidore was born looked nothing like the city we know today. We are at the end of the 11th century, likely around the year 1082, though the records are shrouded in the mists of time. Madrid wasn't a capital back then. It wasn't even a major city. It was a tiny, walled village that had just passed from Muslim hands into Christian hands after the reconquest of King Alfonso VI in 1083. The people there were Mozarabs, Christians who had lived for centuries under Islamic rule, desperately clinging to their faith while absorbing the language, the customs, and the way of life of the Arabs. The landscape was harsh, the fields were bone dry, and water was so scarce that anyone who knew how to find it held a value that exceeded any noble title. In one of the poor outskirts, likely what we now call the La Latina district, Isidore was born. He came from a humble family, poor in coins, but rich in spirit. His parents baptized him with the name of Saint Isidore of Seville, the great doctor of the ancient church. We know almost nothing of his childhood. The sources are so rare that everything we know comes from a single document, the Codex of John the Deacon, a 13th century manuscript that captured the miracles of the saint as they lived in the hearts of the people, a century after his death. What we do know is that Isidore grew up poor. He worked from the time he was a small child. He received no formal education, and he mastered the trades that the earth demanded. He was a laborer, a well digger, and a zahari, a water finder who could sense a spring where everyone else saw only dust. In the scorched earth of Madrid, a man who could find water was more precious than a king. Isidore found water. Where he struck his tool, a spring would burst forth. The neighbors said he had a gift, and they were right. Though the gift was far deeper than they could imagine, there is a detail that often goes unnoticed, but it illuminates Isidore's entire life. When he was born, Madrid was still under Muslim rule. The people he grew up with were Arabized Christians. They lived in two worlds at once. They spoke the language of the conqueror, but they never forgot the language of their faith. They prayed in Latin, while their neighbors prayed in Arabic. They celebrated the Eucharist in secret, or in tolerated corners. To be a Mozarab meant living on the frontier, It meant speaking the tongue of the world without losing the heart of the gospel. Isidore was born on that edge, much like Philip the Apostle, who carried a Greek name in a Jewish world. The frontier didn't divide him, it expanded him. He learned to work the earth using advanced Arabic irrigation techniques. The wells he dug, the channels he carved, they were a masterpiece of culture. But he offered that work to the Christian God. Every single morning at the Church of St. Andrew, the skill of the waterfinder came from the desert culture, but the soul of the saint came from the ancient tradition. In Isidore's hands, those two worlds fused, just as water and earth fused to produce a harvest. In his youth, Isidore entered the service of the Vargas family, one of the most prominent lineages in Madrid. Juan de Vargas was a powerful landowner, but Isidore was just a day laborer, a peon who was paid by the day. No contract, no rights, no security, nothing but the master's will to hire him again tomorrow. The relationship between Isidore and Vargas is one of the most fascinating in all of Christian history, because it isn't the typical story of a saint and a wealthy donor. No, it is the story of a worker and his boss, with all the tension, all the pressure, and all the conflict that comes with it. Vargas was a practical man. He cared about numbers, he cared about the yield, he cared that the work got done on time. And Isidore had a problem. He was late. Every morning, before heading to the field, he stopped at the church for Mass. Not just Sunday Mass, but every day. And let me tell you, the Masses in 12th century Madrid were not short. By the time Isidore reached the plot, the other men had been working for hours. They whispered behind his back. They called him a slacker, a holy man, hiding behind his prayers to avoid the heat of the sun. The complaints reached the ears of Vargas, and that is when he decided to investigate. What he found changed his life and the history of Spain forever. The angel plowing beside the humble man, the white oxen that no one had bought, the field worked with a perfection that defied the laws of physics. Vargas, a man of faith, but also a man of numbers, realized the math made no sense. Isidore prayed, and production didn't go down, it went up. The harvest from Isidore's fields was consistently higher than any other. Divine providence didn't just replace his time, it multiplied it. From that day forward, Vargas stopped complaining. He made Isidore the steward of his entire legacy. The laborer who arrived late became the most trusted man in the house. And the relationship between them, master and servant, rich and poor, transformed into something the medieval world rarely saw: mutual respect, founded on the evidence that God works through the humble, and that prayer is the most productive work a man can ever do. Isidore was not a man who walked his path of holiness alone. He was joined by a woman whom tradition calls Maria Toribia, but whom popular devotion, with a mix of awe and tenderness, knows as Saint Mary of the Head. Now, that name might sound strange, even macabre to our modern ears. It stems from the medieval custom of preserving the head of a saint as a separate relic for veneration. But we must look past the relic to see the real woman. He married a wife, a mother, a woman who earned her place among the saints through her own profound faith. The chronicles tell us that Maria was every bit as devout as Isidore. They were a couple bound by a unity that didn't depend on their circumstances, but on their shared gaze toward heaven. It is said they lived as two in one flesh, one heart, and one single soul. Maria was no passive observer of her husband's sanctity. She was his partner in it. She worked the rugged fields alongside him. She tended the vegetable gardens, she mended their clothes, and she prayed with the same burning intensity as Isidore. She was his strength, his companion in the silence of the Spanish frontier. But even the most virtuous are not safe from the poison of gossip. In the small, tight-knit communities of the outskirts, tongues began to wag. Neighbors, fueled by envy or misunderstanding, began to whisper against Maria, accusing her of infidelity. It is a heavy cross for any woman to bear, but for a saint, it is a trial of fire. Tradition records a miracle that silenced those murmurs forever. To prove her innocence before God and man, Maria approached the Jarama River, and she walked across its surface, on foot, her sandals remaining perfectly dry as she moved across the rushing water. This wasn't just a display of power, it was a divine echo of Saint Peter walking on the Sea of Galilee, a sign that God himself defends those whom the world unjustly accuses. Then, there is a chapter in their marriage that speaks to the deep, sometimes radical spirituality of the Middle Ages. At a certain point in their lives, Isidore and Maria decided to live apart, not because of conflict, not because of a fading love, but for the sake of devotion. Maria retired to a small hermitage near Torrelaguna, the chapel of Our Lady of Mercy. There, she lived as a hermit, dedicated entirely to prayer and the care of the sanctuary, while Isidore remained in Madrid, working the fields of the Master. This was not an abandonment, it was an offering. They gave up the comfort of each other's presence to give themselves more fully to the Creator. To us, this might seem extreme, but in their world, they understood a profound truth. Conjugal love is not a competitor to divine love. It is its fuel. Sometimes, the greatest love is proven in the distance accepted for the sake of God. Maria eventually passed away in the odor of sanctity, and though her path to formal recognition was long, it was certain. Her beatification began in 1612, but it wasn't until the 18th century that Pope Benedict XIV formally approved her cult. Today, she is venerated as St. Mary of the Head, the farmhand's wife, the mother of Ilan, the hermit of Torrelaguna. They stand as one of the few married couples in the history of the Church to reach the altars together, proving to every husband and wife watching today that marriage is not an obstacle to holiness. It is the very pathway to it. Together, they had one son, a boy named Ilan, and it was through this child that the most famous miracle of Isidore's life would unfold. A miracle that every mother and every father who has ever feared for the life of a child will understand in the depths of their soul, without needing a single word of theology. One afternoon, while Isidore was sweating in the fields, Maria came running toward him with the news that no parent ever wants to hear. The boy has fallen into the well. The well at their home was deep, dark, and cold. Its stone walls were slick with moss, impossible for a small child to climb. Little Ilan had been curious, peering over the edge as children do, and in a heartbeat, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Isidore ran. Maria ran close behind him, her heart surely pounding against her ribs. They reached the edge and looked down into the abyss. The boy was submerged. The clock was ticking in seconds, those agonizing seconds that separate life from death, hope from tragedy. In that moment of utter helplessness, Isidore did the only thing a man of God can do when human strength fails. He fell to his knees, and he began to pray. And then, the impossible happened. The water began to rise. It didn't just splash. It lifted, as if an invisible hand were pushing it from the depths. It rose steadily, inch by inch, foot by foot, until the body of the small boy appeared on the surface, floating, being cradled by the water as if by unseen arms. The water rose all the way to the very rim of the well. Isidore simply reached out his hands and pulled his son to safety. Ilan was alive, completely unharmed. The well that should have been his tomb had become his cradle. This miracle of the well is the most beloved image of Saint Isidore, second only to the angels plowing the fields. If you walk across the Toledo Bridge in Madrid today, you will see the great 18th century sculptures capturing this exact moment. The water rising, the father's faith rewarded, It is the image of a man who trusts God when reason says all is lost. And notice how God responds. He responds with water. The very element Isidore had spent his life searching for as a water finder. The water that usually takes life became the water that saves. It obeyed the prayer of a simple farmer, just as the Son would one day obey the Virgin at Fatima. The ancient Codex of John the Deacon records 5 principal miracles, and in every one of them, we see the same divine pattern. Isidore gives what he does not have, and God provides what is missing. Think of the miracle of the mill. Isidore was carrying a sack of precious wheat to be ground when he saw a flock of birds, starving in the bitter cold of winter. He didn't hesitate. He poured half of his grain onto the ground to feed them. His companion mocked him, complaining that they wouldn't have enough flour to survive. But when they reached the mill, the sack was just as heavy as when they started. The wheat had been divinely doubled, or the miracle of the pot. Every Saturday, Isidore shared his meager meal with the poor of the neighborhood. One day, a beggar arrived late after the pot had been scraped clean. Isidore asked Maria to look just one more time. When she lifted the lid, the pot was full. It was overflowing, as if no one had eaten a single bite. Then there was the miracle of the Brotherhood feast. Isidore belonged to a guild that held community meals. One day, he brought several poor men to the table. But there was only enough food prepared for him alone. Yet, when they uncovered the dishes, there was an abundance. Enough to feed the poor, enough for the guild, and plenty left over for the days to come. Every single one of these stories tells us the same thing in different ways. Isidore shares what he has, even if it's little, even if it seems foolish, even if logic says it won't be enough. And God multiplies. It is the arithmetic of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. It is the arithmetic of heaven, where the denominator is always generosity. It is no accident that his miracles involve food and water. They aren't spectacular in the way we often think. There are no levitations, no ecstasies, no hidden prophecies. They are miracles of the kitchen, the well, the field, and the mill. They are the miracles of a man who lives with his hands in the dirt, and who finds God right there, in the mud, in the grain, and in the pot. The holiness of Saint Isidore doesn't float above reality. It is the reality. Holiness is planted in the earth, like a seed that needs the heavy, dark soil to bear fruit. And Isidore was a man who knew the soil better than anyone. Isidore passed away on May 15th, a date that has been etched into the heart of the faithful for centuries, even if the exact year remains a subject of debate. For generations, tradition whispered that he had lived to the ripe age of 90, a long life of tireless labor. However, modern science has its own way of telling the story. In 2022, a meticulous forensic study of his sacred remains suggested he was a man in his prime, perhaps between 35 and 45 years old, when he was called home to the Father. But regardless of his age, he died exactly as he had lived, in silence, far from any stage or spotlight, within the humble walls of a laborer's home in the outskirts of San Andres. They buried him in the parish cemetery of San Andres, in a simple, lonely trench. There was no headstone, no carved name, no marker of any kind to distinguish him from the countless other poor souls of the neighborhood, and there he remained, forgotten by the world, for 40 long years, until someone decided to open that grave. We don't know who it was or what prompted them. The historical records are silent on the why. Perhaps it was the persistent memory of the people, those who had never forgotten the man of miracles, that finally pushed someone to seek his remains. But what they found caused a shockwave that rumbled through the very foundations of Madrid. The body of Isidore was incorrupt. Think of it, 40 years beneath the heavy earth, and his flesh had not decayed. It was intact. It did not smell of the grave. Instead, it gave off a sweet, inexplicable aroma of perfume, a supernatural fragrance that those present could not find the words to describe. His face was serene, as if he were merely catching a moment of rest between chores, and his hands, those rugged hands that had dug wells, guided the heavy plough, kneaded bread for the hungry, and pulled a drowning child from the depths of a well. Those hands were crossed over his chest in eternal peace. Madrid finally had its saint. The body was moved with great reverence into the church of San Andres. From that day forward, the incorrupt remains of Isidore became the village's most precious treasure, a direct line to the divine that the people would call upon whenever their burdens became too heavy to bear. When the rains failed and the harsh, sun-scorched plains of Castile turned to dust, the people of Madrid would carry Isidore through the streets in a solemn procession. The water finder, who, in life, could find springs where others saw only desert, was now called upon from the heights of heaven to open the clouds. And the heavens, they listened. Time and again, the records show that after these processions, abundant rains would wash over the parched earth, saving the harvests and the people, but his influence didn't stop at the village gates. When the mightiest kings of the earth fell ill, they turned to the humble farmhand, Philip II, the most powerful monarch of his era, sought the intercession of Isidore's relics when the best medicine of the age failed to cure him. Philip III was miraculously healed of a deadly fever after praying to the saint. Queen Mariana of Neuburg, Queen Maria Amalia of Saxony, every reigning house of Spain came to venerate that incorrupt body with a devotion that saw no distinction between the faith of a lowly peasant and the faith of a sovereign. In 2022, 9 centuries after Isidore drew his last breath, a forensic team from the Complutense University of Madrid examined the remains using the pinnacle of modern technology. While they corrected the tradition of his age, they revealed something even more fascinating. His bone structure suggested a complex ancestral lineage, perfectly consistent with the Mozarab Madrid of his birth, a frontier land where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures collided and coexisted every single day. And then they found a detail that no one expected. Tucked deep in the throat of the saint was a small coin, a maravedì from the reign of King Henry IV. It had likely been placed there as an offering in the 15th century. When the casket was opened for veneration, think of that image, a 12th century day laborer with the coin of a 15th century king in his throat. It is the perfect symbol of who Isidore was and who he remains, the saint of the humble, venerated by the powerful, the peasant whose casket was carried on the shoulders of kings, the man who owned nothing in this life, but to whom everyone turns when they need everything. The devotion exploded. The people of Madrid didn't wait for a formal decree from Rome. They knew they had a saint in their midst, but the official path to the altar would be a long one, a journey that would eventually connect this simple worker to the highest powers of the world. In the year 1212, decades after Isidore's death, King Alfonso VIII of Castile was preparing for the most decisive battle of the Reconquista, Las Navas de Tolosa. The night before the slaughter, the king had a dream. He saw a humble shepherd who showed him a secret hidden path through the rugged mountains, a way to surprise the enemy forces from behind. The king followed that path. It was there, exactly as promised. The Christian forces flanked the army and won a victory that changed the course of Western history. Tradition has always identified that mysterious shepherd as Isidore, the farmhand of Madrid, guiding his king from the halls of eternity. The bond between the Spanish crown and the saint only grew stronger. Philip II, having been healed by the waters of a spring believed to have been opened by Isidore, watched as his mother, Isabella of Portugal, built a chapel at that very spot. a place known today as the Pradera de San Isidro. The canonization process was grueling. The church demanded documented miracles, reliable witnesses, and evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of a high court. The historical records were scarce, mostly oral traditions and a single medieval codex. But the most eloquent evidence wasn't written on parchment. It was right there in the Church of San Andres, a body that had refused to turn to dust for centuries. Finally, on March 12, 1622, Pope Gregory XV officially canonized Saint Isidore the Laborer, but he didn't enter the halls of the saints alone. He was canonized alongside four giants of the faith: Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits; Saint Francis Xavier, the great missionary to the Far East; Saint Teresa of Jesus, the greatest mystic of the Spanish language; and Saint Philip Neri, the Apostle of Rome. Look at that group: Ignatius, Francis Xavier, Teresa, Philip Neri. They were the titans of history, founders of religious orders, deep theologians, brilliant writers, figures whose work reshaped the entire world. And right beside them, with the same dignity, the same crown of glory, stood an illiterate farmhand from Madrid, a man who had never written a book, never founded an order, and never traveled more than a few miles from his home. A man who simply plowed the fields, dug wells for his neighbors, shared his meager bread with the poor, and knelt at Mass every single morning before the sun rose to start his work. Isidore was the first. He was the first married layman to be formally canonized by the Congregation of Rites. Before him, lay saints were proclaimed by the voice of the people. But Isidore was the one who proved to the world that you don't need a mitre or a monastery to reach the heights of heaven. You only need a plow and a heart that beats for God. Isidro endured the full rigors of the Church's sacred scrutiny, the exhaustive investigations, the formal tribunals, the meticulous examination of every miracle, and finally, the solemn seal of papal approval. In that moment, the Holy Mother Church made a revolutionary declaration. It proclaimed to the world that a simple farmhand, a married man, a father, a man who earned his living by the sweat of his brow, could reach the very pinnacle of sanctity. He was not a cloistered monk. He was not a high-ranking priest. He was not the famous founder of a religious order. He was a laborer, and with his canonization, the very gates of heaven swung wide for all those who work the earth, those who clean the homes, those who raise their children, and those who find the time to whisper a prayer between one heavy task and the next. In the year 1960, Pope John XXIII declared him the patron saint of the farmers of Spain, and by extension, the patron of the entire agricultural world. This was far more than a mere administrative gesture. It carried a profound weight. In the midst of the 20th century agrarian revolution, as millions of workers were abandoning the quiet fields for the cold steel of the factories, the Church stood firm to remind them that the land is holy, that the plough itself is an instrument of God, every seed buried in the dirt, and every blade of wheat harvested under the sun participates in that same divine mystery of death and resurrection that lies at the very heart of our faith. Today, in a world where agriculture has become a cold industry and the traditional farmer is a vanishing breed, Isidro remains the undisputed protector of those who still toil upon the earth. He is the patron of those who rise long before the sun to bring water to their crops, of those who look to the clouds and depend on the rain as one depends on divine mercy. Because the rain, much like mercy itself, cannot be manufactured by human hands. It can only be sought, and it can only be received as a gift. And in Madrid, the city that blossomed from a small 11th century frontier outpost into a grand European capital, every 15th of May, hundreds of thousands of souls gather to honor their patron with festivals, traditional rosquilla pastries, and the rhythmic steps of the chotis. Many who join the crowd may only know Isidro as a name from the past, but those who truly understand, those who have stood before the silver casket in the collegiate church of Saint Isidro and seen his incorrupt body, those who have traveled down to the hermitage in the meadow and drank from his miraculous spring, those who have knelt before the image of the laborer with his team of oxen and his guardian angels, they know. They know that beneath the music and the celebration lies something far deeper than tradition. There is a message that has echoed through 9 centuries without losing its power. The message that holiness does not need a stage. God prefers the open fields to the gilded palaces. A humble hoe in the hands of a man who prays is worth more than a jeweled sword in the hands of a king who does not. And the angels, if God wills it, they will plow. If you could step back in time, back to the rugged outskirts of 12th century Madrid, before the sprawling metropolis ever existed, when it was merely a village of low stone walls and vast farming lands, you would see a figure walking down a dirt path at the break of dawn. He wears nothing special, just the rough clothes of a peasant, a simple hoe balanced on his shoulder, his hands toughened by the sun and the lime of the earth. He walks slowly, not out of fatigue, but because he has paused to pray. He always pauses, every single morning, before the heat of the day begins, before the oxen begin to pull the heavy plow, before everything else. There is God. Isidro founded no great institutions. He wrote no theological books. He never traveled further than the village of Torrelaguna, and he never preached a single sermon from a pulpit. He did nothing that the world would consider great, except for one thing: he lived. He lived with his hands deep in the soil and his heart high in the heavens. He lived by sharing the little he had, even when it seemed there was not enough, even when the cooking pot was empty. He lived by attending the Holy Mass each morning as if it were his first and his last. He lived with an unwavering trust that God would provide, and God did provide. He provided with water that rose from the depths, with wheat that doubled in the sacks, with food that multiplied for the hungry, and with angels who took up the plough when he was on his knees. Saint Isidore the laborer, the farmhand of Madrid, devoted husband of Santa Maria de la Cabeza, father of young Ilan, well digger, water finder, the man who ploughed with angels, pray for us. Pray for those who work the land and depend on the rains of heaven and the mercy of the Lord. Pray for the farmers whom the world forgets even as it eats the fruit of their labor. Pray for the husbands and wives who desire to reach sanctity together, just as you and Maria did. Pray for the fathers who tremble when their children fall into the wells of this life, whatever those wells may be. And teach us that an empty pot is filled when it is shared, that the grain we give away is never truly lost, and that the soul who prays before he works does not lose time. He multiplies it.